The cat that led me to letters hidden for a lifetime. Aunt Eleanor passed away in November 2020, leaving me her house in the small town of Mount Vernon, Oregon. I never really thought about why she left the inheritance to me specifically. She had 3 other nephews, and they all lived much closer to her. But the notary read the will, which included my name along with a rather strange request. Take care of Mrs. Whiskers. She knows all my secrets. Mrs. Whiskers turned out to be a 15-year-old gray cat with amber eyes who greeted me at the front door like an old friend. Neighbor Mrs. Gardner told me the cat had lived with Eleanor for over 10 years and had been her only constant companion. The first few days, I thought the animal was simply missing her owner. Mrs. Whiskers would walk around the house, meowing and clearly searching for someone. Aunt's house was a typical 1950s structure, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a small living room downstairs. When I was a child visiting, Eleanor absolutely forbade us kids from going down to the basement. She always said it was damp and dangerous, that the steps might collapse. Back then, it didn't seem strange. Many adults didn't let children into basements. Now, sorting through her belongings, I finally went down to that forbidden place. The basement turned out to be ordinary. Concrete floors, brick walls, an old furnace in the corner, and several shelves with canned goods. I didn't see anything dangerous. Mrs. Whiskers followed me down and immediately headed to the far wall, where she began scratching at the drywall with her claws. At first, I thought the cat was just playing or sharpening her claws. But she did it methodically, always in the same spot, about 3 feet from the floor. The scratches got deeper and deeper, and soon I noticed that this area sounded different when tapped, more hollow, as if there was empty space behind it. I took the cat upstairs and locked the basement door. But at night, I was awakened by scratching sounds. Mrs. Whiskers had somehow gotten back down. It turned out the door didn't close tightly, and the clever cat had learned to open it. 3 nights in a row, I heard the same sounds, creaking steps, then rhythmic scratching on the wall. On the 4th day, I decided to examine the problem area carefully. Upon closer inspection, it became obvious that this section of wall was different from the rest of the basement. The drywall here was newer, the seams not as neat as elsewhere. The paint also had a slightly different shade, though an untrained eye wouldn't notice it. I called Mrs. Gardner and carefully asked whether Aunt had done any renovations in recent years. The neighbor thought for a moment and said she remembered some workers coming to Eleanor's about 8 years ago. They spent a whole day in the basement, brought bags of cement and drywall sheets. Eleanor explained that she was sealing up an old storage room that was starting to collapse, though Mrs. Gardner thought it strange that such work would require so many materials. This conversation finally convinced me that something was hidden behind the wall. I hired a local contractor, Mr. Thompson, who agreed to carefully open the suspicious section. He arrived the next day with tools and immediately confirmed my suspicions. There really was a cavity behind the drywall. When Mr. Thompson removed the first sheet, Mrs. Whiskers rushed down to the basement, as if sensing that her long efforts had finally paid off. Behind the wall was a small niche lined with brick, and in it stood a metal container about the size of a shoebox. The container was heavy and tightly sealed. The lid bore a sticker reading "Waterproof, 1985." Mrs. Whiskers sniffed the find, and for the first time in several days, looked calm. She curled up next to the container and began purring. Opening the container in my kitchen, I found a stack of letters tied with a red ribbon, several photographs, and a thin notebook in an oilcloth cover. The top letter was dated December 2014 and began with the words, "Dear Mom." My heart skipped. I knew that Aunt Eleanor had lost her only son Tommy back in 1983. Tommy died in prison when he was only 22. At least, that's what we were always told in the family. Eleanor took his death hard and asked us never to mention his name again. We all thought she couldn't bear memories of the son who had gotten involved with bad company and ended his life behind bars. But the letter in my hands was written in masculine handwriting on a sheet from an ordinary notebook. The author introduced himself as Tommy and wrote that he hoped his mother was alive and well. He apologized for the long silence and explained that he finally felt safe enough to try to restore contact. At the end of the letter, he left his address in Salem, Oregon. I went through the rest of the letters. There were more than 20 of them, spanning from 1984 to 2014. All were from the same Tommy, and they gradually revealed an incredible story. Tommy hadn't died in prison. He had been alive all these 30 years. In the earliest letter, dated December 1984, Tommy wrote from a correctional facility. He explained that he had gotten 3 years for drug dealing, but that wasn't the worst part. During the investigation, it became clear that his accomplices planned to use his mother's house to store drugs and threatened her with physical violence if Tommy cooperated with police. The following letters revealed how events unfolded. Tommy didn't cooperate with authorities and got the full sentence, but even from prison, he continued receiving threats. The criminal organization made it clear that after his release, he would have to work for them, and his family would become hostages to ensure his compliance. In a letter from 1985, Tommy informed his mother of his decision. After release, he wouldn't return home and wouldn't maintain contact with her. The only way to protect her and the whole family was to disappear, to make the criminals understand that he no longer represented any interest to them, and his relatives couldn't be used as leverage. Tommy wrote that he would go to another state, change his documents, and start a new life. He asked his mother to tell everyone that he had died in prison from illness. Only this way would the family be safe. The letter ended with words about how he would love her always, but had to become dead to everyone so they could stay alive. Now I understood why Eleanor had told us about her son's death. She wasn't lying out of cruelty or shame. She was protecting him and all of us. If relatives sincerely believed in Tommy's death, none of us could accidentally give criminals information about his whereabouts. But the story didn't end there. Subsequent letters showed that Tommy couldn't completely sever ties with his mother. Once a year, sometimes less often, he sent brief notes reporting that he was alive and well. He never provided a return address and signed only with initials, but the handwriting was the same. From letters of the 1990s, I learned that Tommy served in the Army under a false name, and after discharge worked as a mechanic in different states. He never married or had children, explaining this by saying he couldn't risk other people's lives. In one letter, he mentioned sometimes coming to Mount Vernon and watching the house from a distance, making sure his mother was all right. By the end of the 1990s, the tone of the letters changed. Tommy wrote that the criminal group that had persecuted him had disbanded. The leader died of an overdose. The others were either in prison or also dead. The danger seemed to have passed, but Tommy was afraid to return. He didn't know how to explain to his mother why he had made her and the whole family suffer all these years. In letters from the 2000s, a growing homesickness was evident. Tommy wrote that he followed news of his hometown through the internet, knew his mother was aging, and was tormented by the thought that he might lose her without ever saying goodbye. Several times he started writing that he was planning to return, but each time backed down. The last letter in the container was dated December 2014. In it, Tommy wrote that the criminal group had finally disbanded. The leader was dead, and now he could try to carefully restore contact with his mother. He asked her to give a sign if she received this letter, but didn't provide a return address, only a post office box in Salem. Now, I understood why Aunt Eleanor decided in 2015 to hide the letters more securely and sealed the hiding place. After receiving her son's last message, she realized the danger had passed, but still feared to openly search for him. But the story didn't end there. Going through Eleanor's documents in her bedroom, I came across a small jewelry box hidden behind the dressing table mirror. It contained 3 more letters, later ones, dated 2018 and 2019. These letters came after the hiding place had been sealed, so Eleanor kept them separately. The most touching letter was dated March 2019. In it, Tommy wrote that he was already 58 years old, worked at an auto shop in Salem, and lived alone in a small apartment. He had learned through the internet that his mother was still alive and decided to take the risk. In this letter, Tommy explained that he finally realized life was too short to waste on fears. He was ready to accept any reaction from his mother, even anger and rejection, just to see her once more. He left his phone number and address and asked her to at least let him know if she had received the letter. In the notebook, I found entries that Eleanor made after receiving each letter. Her diary notes showed how painfully she experienced this situation. She wrote that she understood her son's decision and was proud of his willingness to sacrifice himself for the family's safety, but prayed every day that the danger would pass and he could return. Particularly touching was an entry from 2015, where Aunt described how she got a cat specifically so someone alive would be in the house. She named her Mrs. Whiskers, and every evening told her about Tommy, showed his photographs, and read his letters aloud. Eleanor wrote that Whiskers was the only one who knew the truth about her boy. In the same 2015, Eleanor decided to hide the letters more securely. She feared that if something happened to her, relatives might find the correspondence and try to locate Tommy, not knowing about the danger. Eleanor hired workers and turned the old storage room in the basement into a hiding place. Mrs. Whiskers observed the entire process. The cat saw how her owner regularly went down to the basement with the metal container, how workers sealed the niche with brick and drywall. After the renovation, Eleanor no longer went to that wall, but the cat remembered this place as something important to her owner. The last entry in Eleanor's diary was dated April 2019, shortly after receiving Tommy's final letter. Eleanor wrote that she wanted to reply to her son, but didn't know where to start. She was afraid he had changed over these years, that they had become strangers to each other. At the same time, she dreamed of hugging him and saying she had never stopped loving him. Aunt planned to write a reply and even bought beautiful stationery, but never got up the courage. The entry ended with words about how tomorrow she would definitely write to him and find the right words. But tomorrow never came. A few months later, Eleanor had a heart attack, and in November 2020, she died in her sleep. After studying all the documents, I realized I had to find Tommy and tell him the truth about his mother. The address in the last letter was clear: Cherry Street, House 47, Apartment 12, Salem, Oregon. I decided not to call ahead, but to go in person. This news was too important and delicate for a phone conversation. The drive to Salem took 3 hours. I brought with me all of Tommy's letters, Aunt's diary, and several photographs from the container. One showed young Eleanor with a small boy, obviously Tommy, at 5 or 6 years old. Another photo showed the same boy, but older, holding a toy car and smiling broadly. The house on Cherry Street turned out to be an ordinary apartment building from the 1970s. I went up to the second floor and found apartment 12. Before knocking, I took a deep breath, understanding that the next few minutes would change someone's life forever. A man of about 60 with gray hair and kind brown eyes opened the door. He was dressed in work clothes, obviously just returned from work. When I introduced myself and mentioned Eleanor Carter's name, his face went pale. Tommy invited me inside, and we sat at the kitchen table in his small but cozy apartment. When I told him about his mother's death, he covered his face with his hands and was silent for a long time. Then he quietly said he knew about it. He regularly checked obituaries in the Mount Vernon newspaper and had seen the notice about Eleanor's death in November of the previous year. Tommy admitted that after her death, he had come to the house several times and stood on the street, looking at the windows. He saw that someone was living in the house and assumed it was one of the relatives. He very much wanted to approach and tell the truth, but was afraid the family would reject him as an imposter. When I showed him the letters he had written to his mother, Tommy couldn't believe she had saved them all. He was sure Eleanor considered him dead and had long forgotten about him. Learning that his mother had received and read each of his letters, he wept openly, not ashamed of his tears. What shocked him most were the entries from Eleanor's diary. When I read aloud her words about how she was proud of his self-sacrifice and prayed every day for his return, Tommy kept repeating that he didn't know this and thought his mother hated him for all the pain he had brought into her life. We talked until late at night. Tommy told me about his life after prison, how he really had changed his documents, served in the army under a false name, worked in different states. For the past 15 years, he had lived in Salem, worked at an auto shop, and dreamed of the day when he could return home. Tommy showed me his apartment. In the bedroom hung an enlarged photograph of the house in Mount Vernon, which he had secretly taken during one of his reconnaissance visits. On the nightstand lay an old photograph of Eleanor that he had kept from childhood. He admitted that every evening he wished her good night, imagining she could hear him. When I told him about Mrs. Whiskers and how the cat had led me to the hiding place, Tommy laughed through his tears. He remembered that in childhood they had a cat named Smokey who always sensed when he was sad and came to comfort him. Apparently, Eleanor had chosen herself a companion with a similar character. The next day, we drove to Mount Vernon together. Tommy was very nervous. He hadn't been in his childhood home for 39 years. When we pulled up to the house, he stood at the gate for a long time, gathering his courage. Then he slowly walked along the path he remembered from childhood. Mrs. Whiskers met us at the door. As soon as she saw Tommy, she made a special meow, one I had never heard from her before. The cat approached him and began rubbing against his legs, purring loudly and demandingly. Tommy crouched down and carefully petted her. He was surprised that the cat remembered him, but I explained that most likely she recognized a scent or something else that connected her with memories of Eleanor. Perhaps Aunt really had talked about her son so often that Mrs. Whiskers had learned to associate his image with something good. Tommy slowly walked around the house, touching familiar objects and remembering his childhood. In the living room, he found his old photograph on the shelf. Eleanor had never removed it, though she had told everyone her son was dead. In the kitchen, his childhood drawings still hung, which his mother had preserved under glass. In her bedroom, on the dresser, stood a frame with his school photo. When we went down to the basement, Tommy immediately understood which wall his mother had sealed. In childhood, there had been a small storage room there where Eleanor kept canned goods. Now he understood that she had turned this place into a hiding place for his letters. Whiskers sat next to the sealed opening and began purring again. Tommy scratched the cat behind the ear and said she was a smart girl who had kept Mom's secrets and waited for when they needed to be told. The most difficult part was explaining the situation to the rest of the family. When I told my parents that Tommy was alive, their first reaction was shock. Mom said they had buried him in their hearts 40 years ago. Then came understanding of what sacrifice Tommy had made for the family's safety. Uncle Frank was initially angry at Eleanor for the deception. But when I showed him Tommy's letters, he understood the scale of the threat. He admitted that if they had known the truth, one of the relatives might have accidentally revealed Tommy's whereabouts. Eleanor had protected them all, even at the cost of her own suffering. In the following weeks, Tommy began the process of restoring his documents. It turned out that officially he had never been declared dead. Eleanor had filed a missing person report, but hadn't gotten a death certificate. Perhaps she had always hoped for his return. Tommy decided to stay in his childhood home. He quit his job in Salem, sold his apartment, and moved to Mount Vernon. Mrs. Whiskers accepted him as her new owner without any problems. It seemed this was exactly what she had been waiting for all these months after Eleanor's death. We organized a small memorial service for Aunt Eleanor, attended by all her neighbors and friends. Tommy introduced himself as her son who had lived in another state for a long time and couldn't visit because of work. Most people remembered little Tommy and were glad to learn he hadn't died, as everyone had thought all these years. Mrs. Gardner, learning the truth, admitted she had always suspected Eleanor had some secret. Now she understood why her neighbor sometimes looked so sad, especially on birthdays and holidays. Gardner also said she had seen Eleanor talking to the cat during long evenings, showing her some photographs. Gradually, Tommy told other relatives about his existence. Reactions varied. Some were surprised, some rejoiced, others felt deceived. But overall, the family accepted him with understanding. My parents, learning the whole story, said they admired the strength of spirit of both Tommy and Eleanor. Several months later, Tommy received a call that changed his life once again. A private detective he had hired to check on his old case status reported incredible news. It turned out Tommy had a daughter. In the 1990s, while living under a false name in Colorado, he had met a woman named Sarah and lived with her for 3 years. They had a daughter, Jennifer, but when the girl turned 3, Tommy decided he couldn't risk their safety. He disappeared from their lives, just as suddenly as he had once disappeared from his mother's life. The detective found Jennifer through databases and social networks. She lived in Denver, worked as a teacher, and had 2 children. Sarah had died several years ago, but before her death, had told her daughter everything she remembered about her father. Jennifer knew only his pseudonym and approximate age. The first phone conversation between father and daughter was difficult. Jennifer remembered him vaguely and couldn't understand why he had left her and her mother. But when Tommy told her the whole story about the criminal group, threats to the family, forced disappearance, she began to understand. Jennifer admitted she had always felt her father hadn't abandoned them, but was protecting them from something terrible. Now, she understood her intuition had been correct. This spring, Jennifer came to Mount Vernon with her children, 12-year-old Jacob and 10-year-old Emma, to meet their grandfather. Tommy was so excited he didn't sleep all night before their arrival. He was afraid the grandchildren wouldn't accept him, that too much time had passed to create family bonds. But his fears proved groundless. The children listened with interest to the story about Grandma Eleanor, whom they had never seen, and about how the smart cat had helped reunite the family. Mrs. Whiskers, who was 16 by then, happily let the children pet her and even played with them, despite her advanced age. Emma wrote an essay at school about the detective cat that solved a family mystery. Jacob became interested in mechanics and spent hours with his grandfather in the garage, studying how cars work. Tommy showed his grandchildren photographs of their great-grandmother and told stories about his childhood in this same house. Jennifer admitted she had always dreamed of a big family. Now she had a father she thought was lost forever, and a whole branch of relatives on the Carter side. My parents accepted her like a native granddaughter, and Uncle Frank was delighted with his great-grandchildren. Mrs. Gardner, watching the children play in the same garden where little Tommy once played, noted that Eleanor would have been so happy. She had always dreamed of grandchildren, but thought it was impossible. Jennifer decided to move to Oregon to be closer to her father. She found a job at a school in the neighboring town and bought a house 20 minutes' drive from Mount Vernon. Now Tommy sees his grandchildren every weekend, and in summer they spend whole days at their great-grandmother's house. Mrs. Whiskers became particularly attached to the younger grandson, Jacob. The boy suffered from asthma, and the cat seemed to sense approaching attacks before symptoms appeared. She would start acting restless, rubbing against the child's legs and meowing, drawing adults' attention. Thanks to this, they managed to prevent several serious episodes. Tommy said she might have a special gift, or cats simply know how to sense changes in the body better than people do. Last month, the family celebrated an unusual holiday. The day Mrs. Whiskers led me to the hiding place in the basement. Tommy called it Detective Cat Day and bought her a special tuna cake. The whole family gathered at Eleanor's house to thank the old cat for her persistence and loyalty. Jennifer, holding Mrs. Whiskers in her arms, said that without the cat, they would never have learned the truth. She had preserved their family when everyone thought it no longer existed. Tommy told the children about how in childhood they had a cat named Smokey, who was also very smart and devoted. He explained that Mom had chosen Mrs. Whiskers because she saw something special in her. Animals feel more than people think. Recently, another discovery occurred in the basement. Tommy decided to completely renovate the space and turn it into a workshop. When workers tore down the old shelves, they found a small door behind them leading to the crawl space. There, in an old box, Tommy found documents belonging to his father, the man who had left the family when the boy was 3 years old. It turned out the father hadn't simply abandoned them. He had been ill with tuberculosis and was afraid of infecting his son and wife. In a letter addressed to Eleanor, he explained that he was going to a sanatorium and wouldn't return until he was completely cured. But he never recovered. The death certificate showed he had died in a Colorado sanatorium 2 years after leaving. His last letter to Eleanor was full of regrets that he never got to see what a wonderful boy Tommy had become. Jacob noted that he and his great-grandfather were alike. He too had disappeared to protect his family. Tommy was silent for a long time, holding his father's letter. All his life, he had considered himself an abandoned child, and perhaps that's exactly why he himself chose the path of self-sacrifice when threatened. Now he understood that protecting family had been a Carter family tradition, passed down from generation to generation. He admitted that his mother had never told him the truth about his father. She probably didn't want him to blame himself for his father's illness or death. This summer, the family is planning a trip to Colorado to find Jacob and Emma's great-grandfather's grave. Tommy wants his grandchildren to know the whole history of their family, both its bright and dark pages. He believes secrets destroy families, while truth, even painful truth, makes people stronger. Mrs. Whiskers is aging, but still remains the center of family attention. The veterinarian says she's in excellent shape for a cat her age, but everyone understands she doesn't have much time left. Tommy is already thinking about getting a kitten that Mrs. Whiskers could train. In family traditions, Jennifer believes the cat deserves a peaceful old age surrounded by a loving family. After everything she has done for them, it's the least they can give her. Now, when I visit the reunited Carter family, I'm struck by how much the house has changed. Before, it seemed quiet and a bit sad, full of unspoken secrets. Now you can constantly hear children's voices, the smells of home baking, and the sounds of tools working in the garage. Tommy has turned his mother's house into a real family center. On weekends, all the Carters gather here. My parents, Uncle Frank with his family, Jennifer with the children. They prepare big dinners, play board games, tell stories. Eleanor had dreamed of exactly this atmosphere, but didn't dare create it, afraid to draw attention to her secrets. Mrs. Whiskers watches all this bustle with satisfaction. She still chooses the sunniest spots to sleep, but now children often settle next to her with books or tablets. The cat has become a living symbol of family memory, a bridge between Eleanor's generation and the new generation of Carters. A new tradition has appeared in the house. Every Sunday at dinner, someone from the family tells a story about the past, about Tommy's childhood, Eleanor's life, about the grandfather who died in the sanatorium. The children listen with interest and ask questions. Gradually, they learn the whole truth about their family, without embellishment or secrets. Tommy explained that he wants them to grow up knowing they can talk about anything in their family. Secrets are a heavy burden, and let the next generation grow up without it. Jacob has already announced that when he grows up, he'll also become a mechanic like his grandfather. Emma dreams of becoming a teacher like her mother, but also wants to write a book about her family. About the cat that saved everyone. As she says, the Carter family story is approaching a happy ending. But this isn't the end. It's a new beginning. Tommy got a second chance at family happiness. Jennifer found her father and a big family. and the children are growing up surrounded by love and truth. As for me, this story changed my attitude toward life. Now I listen more carefully to the signals that those around me give, both people and animals. Sometimes simple actions hide deep meanings, and behind strange behavior, important messages. Mrs. Whiskers taught me that loyalty and love don't disappear with time. Even when a person isn't nearby, memory of them can live in the hearts of loved ones, and even in the hearts of animals who loved them. And sometimes that memory becomes the key to restoring lost connections. Now, looking at the happy Carter family gathered for Sunday dinner in Eleanor's house, I think about how Aunt finally got what she had dreamed of her whole life. Her house is full of laughter, love, and warmth. Her son came home, her grandchildren are growing up safely, and her great-grandchildren are learning family history in all its colors. And Mrs. Whiskers, comfortably settled on Tommy's lap, purrs her special song, a song about how patience, loyalty, and love always triumph over fear, secrets, and separation. She fulfilled her beloved owner's last request and can peacefully enjoy her well-deserved happiness, surrounded by the reunited family. The story has ended, but life continues, and who knows what other secrets and discoveries await the Carter family in the future. One thing I know for certain: now they will face any trials together, honestly and openly, as it should be in a real family.